Before I introduce the president of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace, I would like to recognize the man behind the center. The chairman and founder of the center, Dan Abraham, is with us today. Would you please stand? Rarely is there a day when some part of the Middle East isn't exploding, either with airstrikes or suicide bombers or exchanges over the Gaza Strip. Peace in the Middle East. Can it really become a reality, or is it only a pipe dream? And would you leave a comfortable seat in Congress to try and contribute to some kind of peace in the area? 4 years ago, our speaker did just that. Robert Wexler served 7 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Florida's 19th District, before taking over as president of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace in Washington, D.C. In Congress and through his work at the Center for Middle East Peace, he has traveled on numerous delegations of the Middle East and has met with leaders of Israel, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Oman. In Congress, Wexler chaired the subcommittee on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and served on the Middle East Subcommittee and the House Judiciary Committee. Congressional Quarterly named him one of the 50 most effective legislators in Congress. Please join me now in welcoming back an old friend to this area, Robert Wexler.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Gail. Thank you to the Forum Club. For any speaker, it would be an honor to be at the Forum Club. For me, it is a particular honor because it's not just coming to the Forum Club, it's coming home and seeing so many old friends. While it is an honor, though, it's somewhat treacherous, quite frankly, because some of the members many of the members are quite knowledgeable and very current on the affairs of the nation and the world, but they also have long memories. And one gentleman, when I walked in, said, friendly, I remember the first time you were here. And I said, oh, I wonder if he's going to get it right. And he did. The first time I was here, I was 27 years old. Dark hair, maybe a little aggressive, too much so. And I was in a county commission candidates debate. The Republican candidate was Ron Howard, and anyway, my friend, as I walked in, said, I hope this state turns out a little better than that one. For everyone who's under 70 years old, I lost that election. Gail was kind enough to introduce my predecessor, Harry Johnston, who I think all of us would agree is the quintessential public servant. No one has served our community with such distinction and character. And maybe I could just tell a very quick story to illustrate the difference between his character and the guy who followed him, me. When Harry was first elected, and he was asked by a reporter from the Palm Beach Post before George Bennett, I believe. They asked Harry, what are your goals? What are your aspirations? What do you want to do as a member of Congress? How do you want to be remembered? And he went into this long, elaborate, high-minded public policy discussion about restoring the Everglades and beach renourishment, and the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and what we needed to do as a country to lead the free world. All these extraordinary, thoughtful public policy discussions. Some years later, when I was asked, what are your goals, Wexler, as a member of Congress, and how do you want to be remembered? I said, I have 2 goals. 1, when I'm done, I want to still be married, and 2, I want to leave not in handcuffs. So, I don't know what many of you think about my tenure in Congress, for as far as I'm concerned, it was a blazing success. Okay. More than 550 people showed up today to talk about the prospects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what I thought I would ask you to do for the next 35, 40 minutes is not be an advocate. Forget your bias. Forget who you are. Forget your identity. Forget what you think about Israel or the Palestinians. Just become a diplomat. Just become someone who's interested in possibly trying to find a resolution to this conflict, as opposed to someone who wants to articulate his or her own point of view. And what I thought we would do is maybe go through a couple of elements of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are 4 core issues: security, Jerusalem, borders, and refugees. And I thought we would start by examining last week, what happened in Washington. Last week in Washington, the Israeli defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon, came and visited with his counterpart at the Pentagon. And he essentially said this: hey, Mr. President, Secretary Kerry, you guys have kind of got this all wrong. What he said was, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not really about borders or security, as important as security is, or refugees or Jerusalem. What it's really all about, he said, and he was repeating things that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has said before. What he said is it's really a conflict because the Palestinians refuse to recognize the state of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. And what he said is, until you guys understand that it's about the other side recognizing us, the Israelis, and our homeland as the homeland of the Jewish people, any discussion about security and borders and all the other stuff doesn't matter. Because those other guys aren't genuine, aren't real. So I thought, now remember, we're not advocates. We're not Zionists. We're not anything else. We're just interested parties. So on the one hand, you have the Israeli government saying, hey, if we're going to resolve this thing, the other guys have to recognize us as a Jewish state. So let's see, what do the Palestinians think and say about that? And what do the Israelis ultimately think and say about it? And is there a way to bridge that gap? And then we'll talk about borders. First off, I thought I'd just give you a snap of what is the Palestinian state. So if President Abbas was sitting here and he was the next speaker, what would he say? What he would say is recognition of Israel as a Jewish state is unnecessary. President Abbas would say to you, hey, Israel made peace with Egypt. Did Egypt recognize Israel as a Jewish state? Israel signed a peace treaty with Jordan. President Abbas would say, did Jordan recognize Israel as a Jewish state? So why, if the Israelis made peace with Egypt and they made peace with Jordan without them recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, why are they asking me to do that? What he'd also say is that recognition of Israel as a Jewish state would undermine the rights of its non-Jewish citizens. After all, 20% roughly of Israelis are not Jewish. What about them? He would also say recognition of a Jewish state, in essence, suggests a theocracy. Is that what you want? And probably closest to his heart, President Abbas would say, for me to say that Israel is a Jewish state would in effect be denying the claim of all of the people I represent, the refugees, who believe that they have a right to return to their homeland. Okay, that seems complicated enough. Now let's look at the Israeli position. If the Israeli defense minister didn't go home already and he stopped off here, or if Prime Minister Netanyahu was here, what would they say? First, they would say what he said last week. Refusal to accept the Jewish right of self-determination in its homeland is a core issue of the conflict. He would say, Hey, this isn't a new concept. The British in the Balfour Declaration, the United Nations, the world, in the partition plan of 1947, all recognized a Jewish right of self-determination in the homeland of the Jewish people. So this has been done before. The issue is just the Palestinian refusal to accept it. What he would also say is this whole issue of minorities that are not Jewish, that's not a problem. That the right of self-determination in no way cancel out the rights of minorities in a nation where there's a real judiciary, which there is in Israel. And what they would say is, we're not asking that the Palestinians necessarily recognize us as a Jewish state before the negotiations start. That's an ending point. And therefore, it's not a precondition, the Israelis would say. It's just where we need to end up, but we need to point that out now so it's not a surprise. Okay. Again, we're diplomats. We're trying to solve this. Let's take a look. Two quick ones. The Geneva Accords, which was a group of Israelis and Palestinians that got together and tried to resolve all the issues on paper. And they essentially took this issue on and they said, here's the language, the magic language. You can read it. Tal Becker. It's a name that might be familiar to some of you. He's one of the smartest Israelis. He currently works in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He defined it, I think, in the most brilliant of ways. And that is, the Israeli claim shouldn't be seen as seeking some type of individual right to Jews, but rather mutual recognition of the Jewish people's right of self-determination, as well as the Palestinians' right of self-determination. Okay, I just started with this, and now I'm going to quickly move to borders. But why did I start with this? Because if all you do is listen to the news counts, and you hear Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, we've got to be recognized as the national homeland of the Jewish people, and you hear President Abbas say, there's no way we're going to recognize them as the Jewish state, you say, it's impossible. But the fact is, when you look at language, and you look at what Israeli and Palestinian negotiators have discussed, what it shows is this. It's not that there isn't language. What it shows is that you need the political will to produce the type of environment that enables the two people to consider a rational conclusion. Without the political will, all the smartest people in the world can't come up with a resolution. With the political will, maybe it's possible. All right. Let me ask you this. Talk about borders, probably most people, they just rolls in their head. Israel's this remarkable nation. It's a miracle in so many ways. It doesn't have borders that are recognized by the international community. It's kind of funny because we all say Israel. We all refer to Israel. When you refer to the United States, I think we all have an understanding of what we're talking about. When you refer to Israel, what are you actually talking about? Are you talking about Israel pre-67? Are you talking about Israel plus the settlements outside of the 67 lines? Are you talking about Jerusalem in its entirety, West Jerusalem and the East Jerusalem parts where there's 200,000 plus Arabs? What's Gaza? In what country? Okay, let's talk about borders. President Obama started out his administration by saying the basis of negotiations should be the 67 lines with agreed territorial swaps. All right. That was a restatement of American policy all the way back to Lyndon Johnson. But some people thought it was a bit controversial. Let's see what he was talking about. The Palestinian position and the Israeli position, and what's at stake. Ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will require drawing borders between Israel and a new state of Palestine. The challenge is to find a solution that addresses the needs of each side. So what are the principles and the values that drive Israeli and Palestinian thinking on the border issue when they come to the negotiation table? Here's the Palestinian position in a nutshell. They see historical Palestine as all theirs. Now, what's historical Palestine? Let me ask one of the students if I could. What's historical Palestine? Anybody know? Go ahead. Good. Essentially, it's the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. It's Gaza, it's the West Bank, and it's pre-67 Israel. That's historical Palestine. Well, Palestinians say it's all ours. That's at least where they started. Then you'll see in 1937 with something called the Peel Commission, the green is what was handed to the Palestinians in principle, and to the Israelis the other side. So the Palestinians went from 100% to the of historical Palestine to 75% with the Peel Commission in 37. Then you had the UN Partition Plan in 47, where the Palestinians went down to 44% of historical Palestine. And what are we talking about now? When President Obama says the basis of negotiations should be the 67 lines with agreed territorial swaps, what he doesn't say, and what no American president has actually said, is the Palestinians get 22% of historical Palestine, and do the math, the Israelis get 78%. All right, let's look at the Israeli perspective. The Israelis say, whoa, hold on, President Obama. The 67 lines, you're going to use them? There's nothing magical about the 67 lines. They were an arbitrary armistice lines that separated Israeli and Arab troops in 1949. Additionally, most Israelis will say, hey, wait a minute. We didn't start that war in 1948. A bunch of Arab countries attacked us. So what country on earth gets attacked and then gives back everything they won? Why would we do that? And some other Israelis, including the current prime minister, say, hey, the 67 lines, they're not defensible. We're not going back there. Okay. What do the Israelis really think, though? And what they're really concerned about when they negotiate borders is what's called demographic realities on the ground. And what does that mean? It means that after 1967, a whole bunch of Jewish people moved outside the 67 lines in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and we'll see in a minute, now more than 500,000 in created towns, settlements. For those who have been to Israel, you wouldn't even recognize the settlements because, in effect, they're suburbs of Jerusalem in many cases. There's not a sign that says, oh, wow, that looks different. So for Israelis, the truth is, the settlements isn't so much an issue about security. It's an issue about, hey, we got 500,000 people who have built garages and basketball courts and soccer fields, and you try moving them. That's crazy. All right, let's see what we actually have. This is what it's all about. More than 500,000 Jewish Israelis have moved outside beyond the 67 lines, and they're your biggest communities. East Jerusalem's 200,000 plus, and other communities range from 7,500 to, you can see, in the tens of thousands. And of course, there are many, many more who are 20 people, 30 people, 50 people. Okay, well, how do we bridge this? You got the Palestinians down to 22%. They're not going any lower. No way, President Abbas would tell you, I've already given up 78%. You Israelis are crazy. I can't give up more. And the Israelis are here saying, wait a minute, we got all these people there. I can't move them. We got to keep them. Well, what do we do? It's called land swaps. Okay. Give the Israelis a good bit of what they've already inhabited, but there's some empty land, so give it back to the Palestinians so Abbas can tell his people they're whole, and the Israelis get to keep the Jewish residents. Now, how would land swaps work? And what does it really mean? Let's look at actual negotiations so you get a sense. But here's also the location. Here's the good news and a whole lot of bad news. The good news is, practically, 75% of the Jewish residents that live beyond the 67 lines, guess what? They weren't completely ridiculous. They live relatively adjacent to the 67 lines. 75% of them. They don't live miles in. They just live quarter of a mile, half a mile in. So with drawing a different map, you could actually incorporate 75%, roughly 375,000 of the Jewish residents inside of the Israeli internationally recognized borders. Now, there are dozens upon dozens of settlements that are not adjacent. But the good news is, generally speaking, they don't contain a lot of people. Now, okay, this is all dependent upon whether or not Israel has any land to actually give back. So with Mr. Abraham's help, we've studied all the available land, and we found land that's adjacent either to the West Bank or Gaza, that doesn't currently have Jewish residents, that doesn't have any strategic security value, that doesn't have any infrastructure, doesn't have any military purpose. And we've identified what is the equivalent of 4.36% of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as potentially land that the Israelis could swap. Now remember that number. Let's make it easy, 4%. Now, just to close this, what have the Israelis and the Palestinians actually negotiated? Real life stuff. Forget this pie-in-the-sky academic stuff. Well, the last time there were real maps passed back and forth, it was Prime Minister Olmert for the Israelis, and there's essentially the map that he gave to President Abbas. And what did he say? He said, I need 85% of my people inside my internationally recognized borders, and in order to do that, I'm taking 5.9, 6% of your land, Palestinians. And he was given back 5.2. Not exactly the same, but he was the closest that any Israeli prime minister had ever come to a one-to-one swap. Remember that, 6%. All right, let's look at what President Abbas did in that same negotiation round, the Palestinian proposal. Look what he said. Okay, Prime Minister Olmert, I'm not crazy. I'm not giving you 85%, but I'm going to give you 62%. And what it really is, I'm giving you 1.6, and he was taking back 2. Let's call it 2, just for round numbers. So Olmert was at 85. Abbas was at 62. Not actually worlds apart. Olmert was asking for 6%. Abbas was willing to give 2%. What number did I ask you to remember before? 4%. I'll ask the students again. What's the middle position between 2 and 6? 4. All right. Just for fun, I'm not going to talk about them. Here's other maps. A whole bunch of smart people in Washington, including us, we come up with maps and we pass it around amongst all of each other smart people. And people have got creative ways to do that. But I'll go back to my original point. It's not about having the most creative map drawers. It's about having political leaders that have the political will to do it. All right, so let's just go back and end this. What's this really all about? The challenge when we talk about borders is, can a border be drawn between Israel and a new state of Palestine that includes the vast majority of Jewish Israelis who live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem within Israel's internationally recognized borders, but at the same time create and enable a Palestinian state that is viable, that is contiguous, and looks like a country. And what do I mean, looks like a country? Because nobody is going to accept a country that looks like Swiss cheese. If you have one guy who lives in one city and he's going to visit his friend that lives in a city 5 miles away, but to keep in his own country, he's got to drive 50 miles, he's going to say to his leaders, what did you guys agree to? This isn't a country. And also, this is what President Abbas often tells Danny Abraham and others when he comes to see him. He says, after I sign a deal, the day after, I can't have one of my people who lives in Ramallah, who wants to go visit their cousin in Amman, Jordan, drive up to the border and give their Palestinian passport to an Israeli soldier. Because you know what? If they do, they're going to say from their perspective, the occupation from their perspective is not over. So what President Abbas has said, and now I'm going beyond borders and I'm going to stop, is I can agree, meaning him, to a non-militarized Palestinian state. I can agree to having foreign troops here, international troops. He's even said American troops. He's even said Jewish troops. But I can't have Israeli troops here because my people won't believe it's over. And from the Israeli side, they rightfully say, hey, we're not signing any agreement unless the Palestinians and the world say the conflict is over. End of claims. That's it. Book closed. And at the same time, they say, hey, we just fought a war with thousands of rockets coming our way, and that was from Gaza. Now you're asking us to give back the West Bank, which is even more treacherous, where guys with literally hand grenades and shoulder-mounted ammunitions can shut down our airport, even though they shut it down from Gaza. So we need even extra security considerations. And the Israeli Prime Minister now even suggests, I can't give back any of it. So I didn't mean to present a rosy picture like this is just doable, like that, because obviously it isn't. But I'll go back to, I hope, what was sort of my original point and really stop. Yes, the substance is difficult, it's tricky, but you need political will. Political will can amount to the type of compromise that allows the people over time, not immediately, to resolve the four core issues: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, and security, and add a fifth: recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Thank you very much. This is what I think. Number one, stopping ISIS is not only at this point a security and homeland security responsibility of the United States, but maybe even more importantly, it will be viewed as a sign, an illustration of whether the United States can be relied upon by our allies, and whether or not that we're the policemen of the world, we're not, we shouldn't be, but whether or not there will be a certain order in the world while the United States still leads the free world. So this is what I think. I think President Obama was wise to recognize reality. The reality is we're not going to send battalions upon battalions of troops to the region. We can debate whether or not he should have said it up front or not. That's a fair debate. What I think we should be prepared to do, if our allies, particularly our allies in the region, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and right next door in Turkey, if they're willing to commit troops, we should be ready to commit, I believe, if our military personnel and leaders suggest so, the use of our special forces along with their counterparts. Now, that's not something the American administration has thus far indicated, but my instinct tells me ultimately that's where we're going to be headed. But everyone keeps saying that air power alone can't have the desired results, and that may be the case. But air power can have enormous results. President Clinton showed that when he dealt in the Balkans. Air power won the day. Now, that's a different conflict, no doubt. But one other thing, and I'm not here to debate the Kurds and so forth. The Kurds have been so far very brave in their fighting. But let's remember one thing. The PKK is a terrorist organization under American law. And we shouldn't look at this in a partisan vacuum. This isn't about President Obama or President Bush or Clinton or Democrats versus Republicans. As Americans, we need to be honest with ourselves. Under almost every creation of policy over Democratic and Republican administrations, we have a long history, a very proud one, but a very long history of backing a whole bunch of groups that turn out not to be our friends. And we've done that a couple of times now, and it's come back to bite us a whole bunch, and I don't say this in a critical way. So what is it about our experience with Al-Qaeda, who we supported, and a whole bunch of other groups? What is it about ISIS in certain ways? What is it about our past experience that thinks we're going to pick the right horse this time, and it won't come back to bite us? So I think President Obama has been quite wise to be patient and resolute in trying to figure out just the right recipe. The unfortunate truth is there is no magic recipe for success. The unfortunate truth is that we have got to work diligently to support the Iraqi leadership. There's good news there in terms of their unifying. But let me, if I could, just bring this back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if I may, just quickly. Sure. Because there's a part of this. Because there are some people that say, well, if you just resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then a whole lot of things in the region will get better. Well, I would say that's not true. However, there is a counterpoint, or at least a follow-up. It's not true that if you resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Libya becomes a functioning state. It's not true if you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that the killing in Syria is going to be done and over. It's not true that the Iranians will stop their quest for a nuclear weapon if you resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, what is true, and which is really important, is, as someone who I'd like to think is a dedicated Zionist, somebody who believes deeply, emotionally, personally, substantively in the strength of the American-Israeli alliance, that what Israel needs to do, not to solve the region's problems, that Israel needs to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be on the right side of history, and in order to ensure one essential fact. The Zionist dream is what? It's to create a Jewish and democratic state. And until Israel resolves its conflict with the Palestinian people and creates borders and in effect separates, divorces from the Palestinian people, the Zionist dream of a Jewish and democratic state is endangered. Because what we have now is close to a situation where an equivalent amount of Jews and Arabs live between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And once you get to the point where you no longer have Israel in terms of what it controls as a Jewish democratic state, the Zionist dream is not complete and it's endangered, and it's very important to keep considering possibilities like we discussed. That was a lot broader than your question. In my experience, it's kind of funny or frustrating. When President Bush was president, and I traveled around the Middle East, everybody I met, every Arab leader, a little bit less so in Israel, but everybody I met basically said one thing: you guys are too aggressive. You guys are fighting everywhere. You guys are imposing your will. Stop already. You're causing all these problems. You're making matters worse. Okay. Now, President Obama's president. What do you hear? You guys aren't doing enough. You guys aren't aggressive enough. You guys don't have troops on the ground. American boys and girls are fighting men and women. They're not everywhere like they were. You guys are receding. Where's your leadership? My only point in referencing that is there are responsibilities and realities of still being the world's single superpower. And that we are. And yes, it's a more multipolar world, and China is rising, and there's a whole lot of complicating factors, not the least of which is this uprising in the Arab world, which is unbelievably unpredictable. But at its core, America must exert leadership, and the exertion of that leadership will cause parties to act, of course, in their self-interest always, but if America is strong, ultimately we can oftentimes persuade, cajole, and otherwise create a dynamic that is more in line with our interests, but it doesn't mean that people are going to like us or that they're going to thank us. Very rarely will they. Very rarely will they. Particularly when doing so threatens that leadership in terms of his or her, usually his, public opinion in his own country. Take the Saudi leadership, for instance, and I don't mean to be disrespectful at all. No nation, no government on earth is probably more dependent on its relationship with America than the Saudi leadership. And yet, you're not going to hear the Saudi king making speeches in Riyadh or Jeddah about this extraordinary partnership with the United States. My point is, we need to identify what our core interests are and pursue them. Pursue them, of course, in concert with our allies, but not worry, I don't think, in my humble opinion, so much about what the world always thinks about us, because we should have also learned one other lesson. When we were following President Bush's policies, we weren't so popular. And guess what? Now that we're following President Obama's positions, we're also not so popular. So that tells me, forget popularity, let's do what we think is right, and the chips will fall.
Thank you. Thank you, students.